So, there was this guy. His name was George A. Romero, and Romero had gained some notoriety by basically inventing the modern concept of the zombie with a trilogy of films: Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead. Pretty much every zombie story since has been a response in some way to that original trilogy. Every zombie some kind of take on Romero's zombie. Usually zombies are used as a gateway monster into larger ideas about the human condition, since the lawlessness brought about by a zombie plague tends to bring out a person's true colors. Racism, materialism, nationalism, you can tie whatever theming you want into these guys. Or don't, you can just use them as easy, cheap movie monsters, where the makeup is easier than most practical effect monsters and you don't really have to bother writing dialogue or characterization for these things unless you really want to. And in fact, the blank slate nature of zombies made them ideal enemies in video games. Human in many ways, but removed from humanity enough so that you don't feel bad mowing them down. They have clearly defined weak points, gotta shoot them in the head. They're weak, but they also swarm, making them ideal early game foes, and their rotting forms and the visceral gore brought about by their destruction was fitting in the teenage-aimed blood and guts fun of a post-Doom video game scene. The big breakout for zombie games came in 1996 with Capcom's Biohazard, or as it was known outside of Japan, Resident Evil. The game tells a story about a special SWAT unit called STARS investigating a series of murders around a deserted mansion in the middle of nowhere. They're soon overrun by zombie dogs and have to take shelter within the mansion, and through exploration discover that the location is in some way tied to the Umbrella Corporation, a biomedical company who ended up developing the T-virus, which creates zombies and other monstrosities. The first Resident Evil was a financial and critical success, and production for a second game in the series began shortly thereafter. Meanwhile, Romero hadn't really been doing much. He had his zombie trilogy and a handful of less culturally significant but still highly regarded horror flicks in the 80s, but the 1990s proved to be a slow period for him. He adapted a Stephen King novel called The Dark Half in 1993, but when it didn't do so well, Romero took what would end up being a 7-year break from feature films. But not from filming entirely, because in 1998, Romero found himself directing a series of commercials for Resident Evil 2. They're pretty simple things: shots of zombies, a car on fire, and 2 actors playing the main leads of the game. No dialogue, no real story to speak of, but the high production values resulted in some pretty popular advertising. Resident Evil 2 would probably have made money anyway, but it ended up setting sales records, becoming the highest grossing title for the single platform and surpassing the revenue of most Hollywood films. The obvious Romero influence on the franchise and his direct involvement and experience in adapting the franchise iconography to film made him the ideal candidate when it came time to consider a Resident Evil movie. Romero was commissioned to write a script, so he had an assistant record a playthrough of the first game for him to study, which might make it the first professional Let's Play. From that, Romero wrote a first draft that was by and large faithful to the story of the first game. There are a few character tweaks, a romance subplot was added, but in comparison to most video game movies that had hit the market in the early 1990s, or even now, Romero's Resident Evil was practically a photocopy of the first game. So, naturally, Romero was fired and his script was thrown in the trash. Hollywood do as Hollywood do. There's never really been a concrete reason given for this. Best I can figure, studio execs were looking for something more action-oriented to compete in a post-Matrix world, though it's not like horror movies weren't profitable at the time. This is post-Scream after all. Horror movies were back in a big way. In 1999, the year all of this stuff with Romero would have been happening, The Sixth Sense was the second highest grossing film of the year, and The Blair Witch Project was one of the most successful films of all time in comparison to budget. Now, I don't necessarily think Romero's Resident Evil film would have been amazing. Romero's made his fair share of flops, and that first draft script was just okay. But this whole story does help illuminate the creative priorities behind the Resident Evil film we actually got. Before we get into that, let me just reiterate something I've mentioned in other videos. I don't personally care all that much about accuracy to the source material. I don't think changes, even extensive changes that make something an adaptation in name only, are inherently bad things. All that really matters is the quality of the film itself. An unfaithful adaptation does not take anything away from the original. Once the movie's over and you pop in your original Resident Evil back into your PlayStation, you're not going to find the characters replaced by Michelle Rodriguez. It's going to be the exact same game that came out in 1996, with your giant spiders and Jill sandwiches. And that's another thing. The Resident Evil games weren't exactly high literature to begin with. As games, they're pretty nifty in their use of resource management as a way to build tension, where even save files are a consumable resource. But in terms of story and presentation, they're pretty much haunted house at the county fair. A lot of schlock, a lot of cheese. Resident Evil 2 was the most serious of this series, but that was more the exception than the rule. Resident Evil is far more about giant snakes, villains cosplaying as Napoleon, and our heroes punching boulders. Mila Jovovich kung fu kicking a zombie dog is not out of place tonally as you might expect. After ditching Romero, the project was given to Paul W.S. Anderson, which on paper wasn't that crazy of an idea. He had directed what many would argue to be the one half-decent video game movie of the 90s, Mortal Kombat, which really is more of a case of being better than the competitors than actually being good. For the record, here's what the film takes from the video games. We have the Umbrella Corporation, which creates the T-virus that in turn creates zombies and monsters. The Umbrella Corporation has a lab near Raccoon City. One of the monsters is a thing called the Licker, and that's it. A company, zombies, and one monster. Not a single character or location from the game show up here. They do in the sequels, but the first Resident Evil film is very much its own beast. That's not what brings this film down. What brings this film down is its inability to capitalize on its own potential. Resident Evil is a perfect example of a film that could have been good if they had just tried. The first 20 minutes of the film are incredibly promising. There's a condescending bit where a narrator tells you the Umbrella Corporation's got its fingers in a lot of pots, but after that, we have 20 solid minutes of no expository dialogue, no info dumps as to who anybody is or what the situation is. Everything is inferred through action and characterization. The first chunk of the film involves Umbrella employees dealing with a sudden dysfunction of systems. A fire alarm goes off, doors seal employees in, elevators malfunction, gas is flooded into rooms. It's some decent opening horror elements that play on things like claustrophobia, though audiences might be confused on why there's a computer gone amok thing going on in their zombie movie. But what's really important here is how the film is establishing elements in organic ways. We're establishing location that our protagonists are going to explore later on, and in establishing the areas people are trapped in, you also know where the zombies are going to be concentrated in later parts of the film. Labs, offices, an elevator. This is information given to the audience as a tool of suspense. We know where the zombies are, but the characters don't. So if, say, someone really needed to get that elevator open, the audience should be squirming in their seats, thinking, "No, don't open that. You don't know what's in there. It's full of zombies." That's suspense. There's also some subtle storytelling going on in these scenes. This is a contaminant breach. The T-virus is loose in the building's ventilation systems, a situation you'd think there'd be some pretty serious protocol for. But the alarm is for a fire drill, so everyone just thinks it's a fire drill. You'd think that'd be a serious oversight in protocol, unless you don't want a bunch of contaminated people rushing towards the exits. You want to shut things down, but don't want to panic people so that they don't act quickly. There's a lot more going on here than just elevator shenanigans. The second part of these first 20 minutes involves Mila's character. We've never given her a name, but she's credited as Alice. She wakes up in the shower in a lavish mansion. Through her expressions, it's pretty clear that she has no idea where she is or how she got there. For the next 4 minutes, there's no dialogue, just Alice exploring her environment and trying to figure out what's going on. She has bruises, and she doesn't know where they came from. The dresser drawers are full of pressed white clothing that's probably never been touched, and then a drawer full of military-grade weaponry locked behind a keypad. What is this place? The film lays down a thick layer of atmosphere, and the small details are fantastic. You want to know the moment that I sat up and went, "Wait, this movie might be onto something." Alice finds a notepad with the words, "Today all your dreams come true," written on it. She grabs a pen and writes the same thing beneath it. She's checking the handwriting to see if it's hers, because at her current state, she wouldn't be able to recognize her own handwriting. There's an attention to detail here that is unexpected in a Hollywood-produced zombie horror film adapted from a video game directed by the Mortal Kombat guy. Even when a bunch of commandos break into the place and start shoving everybody around, dialogue is kept to a minimum. We watch as they solve problems, like getting a train working, while still largely in the dark as to what's going on. And then, those 20 minutes are over. There's a huge exposition dump. These guys tell Alice who she is, what the mansion is, what's going on in the Umbrella Corporation offices, that something's gone wrong with the central computer known as the Red Queen, yada yada yada. It's not that I think exposition in itself is a bad thing, but this marks the moment where the film forgets all of those promises it had made and proceeds to just do whatever the hell it feels like. Craft of filmmaking be damned. First off, all the location setups were for nothing, because the majority of the film after this point takes place in areas that were not introduced then. The middle part of the movie is set in a rusted basement/sewer tunnel area that wasn't introduced in those first 20 minutes. Why are there zombies down here? We didn't see people down here. We established zombies in the upper levels, but not here. Are they teleporting? That whole elevator full of zombies suspense thing doesn't work because we never associated the elevator with these lower levels that suddenly exist. We last saw it stuck on the office levels. In fairness, there are a few things that do get payoffs. Those zombie dogs are set up. There's a background detail about a rabbit that gets a callback. But for every one of those, we get characters walking around in offices that should be full of zombies, because that's where we established they were. But nah, just one zombie. I guess all these mindless husks managed to escape the sealed room and get down to the lower levels without working elevators. You know, like zombies do. Most of the mystery surrounding Alice is given through infodump as well. She's an Umbrella employee tasked with guarding the mansion entrance on the facility, and she has the innate ability to jump kick a monster dog in the face. Okay, yeah, as the film series progresses, there's more to Alice than that, but for this first entry, it's pretty much straightforward. So the question is, what function does Alice serve to the story? Why is she needed? Why is she there? The commandos don't need her. They would have gone about their mission regardless. For them, Alice is just another gun arm in the fight against the Walking Dead. In fact, you could argue that she takes away time from the commando story, who are not characters in the slightest. Most of them don't have names. Only 2 of them can said to have personalities, and one of them only has a personality because she's played by Michelle Rodriguez, who plays the exact same aggressive, difficult character she plays in every single thing she's in. She doesn't have much range, is what I'm saying. Half of them get killed in one scene, by lasers rather than zombies, because this is still more about an evil office building than it is about the undead, but you barely notice because none of these guys were ever given any character. In fact, there is not a single character arc in the entire film. The nearest thing we get is Alice's memories coming back, but that's not a character arc. That's a blank slate getting filled in with her original characterization. It's a character restoration, and that's not the same thing. There is a corporate espionage subplot concerning a case of T-virus and T-virus antidote that Alice plays into, but since she's a blank slate amnesiac for the majority of the film, it actually doesn't have anything to do with her. Losing her memories mean that, for a time at least, she is a different character from the one complicit in those acts. I mean, okay, maybe not philosophically, but narratively speaking, she's a different character. And figuring out her involvement doesn't involve any detective work. It's simply a matter of re-triggering the memories. Nobody has to work for the resolution of that subplot. It just happens on its own. The first 20 minutes bills Resident Evil as a detail-oriented film, but when it comes time to actually use those details, it switches to autopilot. So again, what function does Alice serve? Her amnesia makes her a typical audience surrogate, a point-of-view character for other characters to deliver exposition to. But surely she could have been someone outside of the Umbrella Corporation, a civilian who stumbled into this situation by accident. We don't need amnesia. Amnesia's cliché, and not giving her amnesia allows for actual characterization. But then you can't have her matrixing around the place if she's just a rando. You could have made her one of the commandos, but then she either knows what's going on and doesn't need those exposition dumps, or you have to make the entire squad of commandos uninformed as to what's going on, which is actually what happens in the first Resident Evil game, so what the hell? Basically, the need for a kick-ass action star overrid the need for compelling mystery and good characterization. There's a lot of creative decisions here that I just don't understand. that I feel needed at least 2 or 3 more drafts to really work out. Why the Alice in Wonderland motifs? Our main character's name is Alice, we have the Red Queen, there's a white rabbit, but none of that means anything. There's no thematic similarities between Resident Evil and Alice in Wonderland. It's a case of, it just sounded cool in my head. The Red Queen projects itself as a hologram of a little girl, and we're told that that girl is modeled after the head programmer's daughter. But that doesn't mean anything. We don't meet the head programmer. This is just weird trivia that sounds like it's setting up for something but isn't really. There's the big CGI monster called the Licker, and every time it eats human flesh, it evolves, which just means it gets a little bit bigger. It only eats one person, and it was already pretty huge, so it goes from being big to being a little bit bigger, in a way that the audience can't really perceive in any meaningful way. The size difference needs to be dramatic, like have the thing start off the size of a poodle and have it grow as it kills more people. And you don't realize how much it's grown till the final showdown and, oh my god, it's huge! Who would it eat? Well, what about those 4 you killed in the laser room? Certainly it makes more sense to be eaten by a monster in a horror movie than to be sliced up by lasers. This just doesn't want to be a horror movie in any meaningful way. There's no care for suspense, for tension, or even for gore. This movie is remarkably void of blood and gore typically associated with a zombie flick. And the movie's still rated R. I don't know why. I mean, I know why. It's because there's about 5 F-bombs and 1 side boob. But that's easy enough to trim out. Otherwise it feels like a typical no-chances PG-13 Hollywood action film. Why make it an R if you're not going to take advantage of it being an R-rated film? Why aren't these people getting torn apart by zombies? Why aren't these zombies getting torn apart by the commandos? That's half the reason you make a zombie movie in the first place. This film, Resident Evil, it's like a stick. And you have a whittling knife, and you think you can maybe carve this stick into something neat. So you start whittling, but you whittle too far. Off goes the ties with Romero, even if he is the king of the zombie legacy. Off goes the connections to the original game. We'll make it an original story instead. Off goes the characters, off goes the plotting, off goes all the tiny details that could have built to something interesting. And soon, whatever you were trying to whittle that stick into, now it's just a pile of toothpicks. You hasten to glue the toothpicks into some kind of structure and then pretend it's what you meant to do all... Okay, this is a stupid analogy, but this is a stupid film that had no reason to be. It wasn't doomed from the start, it had genuine potential. But it dismissed all of that in searching for some modern trend in action filmmaking, another victim of the studio machine. A weak zombie film, but surely a zombie of a film.